Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our discussion on Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. I'm Shihoko Goto, Director for Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise and Deputy Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. For both Japan and the United States, Southeast Asia has come to play an increasingly vital role as the two countries look to develop their security and economic strategies towards the Indo-Pacific. But whilst the need for Tokyo and Washington to partner more effectively with Southeast Asia is clear, there are also growing concerns about increased focus from the United States, as well as Japan, which may actually be contributing to a widening divide amongst the 10 ASEAN member countries that can also jeopardize ASEAN centrality. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Kei Koga, one of the world's leading scholars focused on Indo-Pacific security and ASEAN, to lead today's discussion. Kei is the Wilson Center's current Japan Fellow, a fellowship that was established over a decade ago through the generous support of the Tokyo-based Sasakawa Peace Foundation. Kei is also an associate professor for the Public Policy and Global Affairs program at the School of Social Sciences with Nanyang Technological University, based in Singapore. I am also excited to be joined today by Dr. Prashant Paramiswaran, a Wilson Center Global Fellow who is also the Deputy Head of Research at Bauer Group Asia, a consultancy group based in Washington. So Kei, during your time at the Wilson Center as a Japan Fellow, you drafted a policy brief about recalibrating the Indo-Pacific strategies of both the United States and Japan towards ASEAN. Can you highlight some of your findings about the strategies of Washington and Tokyo and the outlook for ASEAN in a free and open Indo-Pacific roadmap?
Right. Thank you very much. At first, I'd like to thank you for your kind introduction, Shioko-san. And I'm also grateful to have the Prashant, one of the leading experts in the Southeast Asian affairs, as a discussant today. And I really appreciate the Wilson Center for giving me an opportunity to present my policy paper, Recalibrating the US-Japan Indo-Pacific strategies toward ASEAN. So, as the title of the paper says, my research at the Wilson Center focused on the US and Japanese Indo-Pacific strategies toward ASEAN, the association of the Southeast Asian nations. The reason why I chose this topic was that every time the United States and Japan talked about the respective Indo-Pacific strategy or meet at the multilateral or the unilateral meetings such as the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and even Quad, they emphasize the importance of the ASEAN or ASEAN unity and centrality, and also the ASEAN's Indo-Pacific vision, the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, so-called AOIP. And I believe they are right. The ASEAN is important in the Indo-Pacific region. At the end of the day, ASEAN is geographically situated in the center of the region, and it is the region that connects the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, where the vital sea lines of communication exist. And Southeast Asia's entire market size and economic growth is attractive too. ASEAN is also the multilateral institution that has long economic growth, long being the core of the East Asian regionalism, nurturing the regional norms and the rules. So considering the fundamental objectives of the US and Japanese Indo-Pacific strategies, free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP, is to maintain and enhance the existing rules-based order in the region. ASEAN plays an important role. But that said, it is not really clear exactly how the United States and Japan approach to ASEAN. They do not tell much about the what strategic role in the Indo-Pacific region ASEAN should play, or what ASEAN unity and centrality means to them, and what geographical area ASEAN should focus on. And also another issue is the regional institutional arrangement in the Indo-Pacific. The United States has begun to establish and support new regional frameworks that are not led by ASEAN, such as the Quad, AUKUS, and the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, IPEF. And we do not know what kind of the institutional relationship ASEAN and those new frameworks would look like in the future. So to answer these questions, I try to talk to as many people from the government and the research institutions in Japan and the United States as possible. And in the past 3 or 4 months. And obviously it was a bit hard to conduct interviews because of it was summertime, and also it was the COVID-19, there was the COVID-19 restrictions. So, but it was not, the environment is not the best, but at the same time, I was able to get the very useful insights and the responses from those who kindly let me meet in person or online despite their busy schedule. So anyway, after conducting these interviews, my findings is that there has not been any concrete strategic approach toward ASEAN in the US and Japanese Indo-Pacific strategies. And this is not really surprising, but and many people are already aware of it. So first of all, everybody says, yes, ASEAN is important. We need to support and empower ASEAN. But as opposed to the statement in the Indo-Pacific strategy, the United States implicitly puts the ASEAN a lower priority. And this does not mean that the United States is disengaging from Southeast Asia. What it does is to emphasize the importance of bilateral relations with the particular Southeast Asian states, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Vietnam. When the United States talks about the Southeast Asia, it tends to consider those countries, not the region itself. And on the other hand, Japan does not put the ASEAN on the back burner. Japan considers ASEAN has been arguably the most important multilateral institution in East Asia. So Japan has been trying to consolidate ties with ASEAN by facilitating functional cooperation in the 4 areas that the AOIP stipulated. So those are namely the maritime cooperation, connectivity, UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and economic and other possible area of cooperation. And assisting the ASEAN member states through those functional areas, Japan has comprehensively engaged in the almost all the ASEAN member states. But even Japan does not clarify what the role ASEAN as a regional institution should play in the Pacific region. And as I said, currently the United States and Japan have paid more attention to institutionalize new unilateral and multilateral groupings instead of increasing its engagement with ASEAN. So why does this happen? And they actually try to explore, and then to some extent, this is understandable. The main reason is that the traditional regional security architecture in the Asia-Pacific region was no longer effective in addressing the emerging strategic issues. This architecture is basically anchored by 2 mechanisms: the United States US bilateral security alliances in East Asia, the so-called hub and spoke system, and the other one is the ASEAN's multilateral frameworks. In the post-Cold War, there was a basic institutional division of labor between those 2 mechanisms. On the one hand, the US hub and spoke system checks the rise of the potential regional hegemon and prevent it from being too hostile, and also prevent it from destabilizing the regional security. On the other hand, ASEAN provides fora for dialogue, and where rival major powers actually can meet and then talk, build confidence, and nurture norms and rules and to stabilize the region. So under the rigid US unipolar system, this seems to actually work. But because of the rise of the assertive China, which challenges the existing international rules and norms, there were issues that those traditional architecture was not able to address effectively. So particularly in the 2010s, this became apparent. In 2012, ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting was not able to issue a joint communique for the first time in its history because of the internal controversies over how to stipulate the tensions over the South China Sea, specifically the Scarborough Shoal incident. After 2013, China's Belt and Road initiatives became attractive to developing countries in the region, and which also increased Chinese economic and then political leverages over there. And in 2016, after the South China Sea Arbitral Tribunal's award came out, ASEAN was not able to touch on that in their joint the declaration or communique. And now, moreover, ASEAN is facing internal trouble because the Myanmar junta, Tatmadaw, conducted a coup in 2021 that caused a democratic backsliding in the country. So with all those developments and also issues, we probably would think if this is the case, we should not expect too much from ASEAN, and perhaps the status quo would be the best option. That is to pay respect for ASEAN diplomatically, and then to keep the current level of engagement. And at the same time, we could build new frameworks that are more result-oriented, getting things done with the regional major powers. So we don't really need to devise a new strategy toward ASEAN in the US and Japanese Indo-Pacific strategies. So this kind of the thinking could actually emerge. So I started to think if this is really feasible and also the desirable. And I came up with the 3 strategic options, including the status quo and what kind of the benefits and costs we could get by pursuing each of these strategies. And then those kind of 3 strategic options is the first one is the benign neglect, which is the status quo policy. And the second one is the enhanced engagement. And the third one is the strategic coordination. The first option is the benign neglect. This is basically the status quo policy that has 3 objectives. The first one is to prevent China from exploiting ASEAN unity in its favor in the issue which do not comply with the existing international rules and norms. What I'm thinking about is that the current discussion on the code of conduct in the South China Sea. And the second one is to support ASEAN's institutional reform at a minimal cost. And the third one is to enhance newly established non-ASEAN regional groupings, such as the Quad and the IPEF. But the cost of this the option is that it is likely to facilitate regional division. If the United States focuses on enhancing the bilateral relations with particular Southeast Asian states, and then those who got neglected would incline to align with China and oppose to any initiatives that the United States launch in the region. And if this becomes the case, at worst, ASEAN is going to be dysfunctional and the region will be divided. The second option is the enhanced engagement. Basically, its objective is to enhance the US and Japanese engagement with the Southeast Asian states and reinvigorate the ASEAN by increasing the further economic assistance and capacity building programs. For this option, there might be the 2 important conditions, however. The first one is that the United States and Japan may need to exclude the Myanmar, as the junta is not recognized as the legitimate government internationally, but they may engage informally and bilaterally to maintain the channels of communication. And second one is the United States and Japan discuss with the ASEAN whether ASEAN's geographical scope should be really the entire Indo-Pacific, because given the ASEAN's limited diplomatic and material resources, it is not feasible for ASEAN to engage the entire region. So maybe ASEAN's role would be should be limited to the certain regions such as Southeast Asia. And the cost of this strategic option is high uncertainty of the success in operationalization. There will be a number of questions about these options. For example, the most obvious one is the resource constraints. How much resource we can actually provide to enhance the engagement with the Southeast Asian countries. And also another one is the more political, such as that whether the United States can give up human rights consideration for its engagement. Japan seems to me they are taking the softer approach to that end. It started, but still, I think the current administration started to consider the criteria of those fundamental values such as the democracy and human rights and the rule of law. So it is not clear whether they can actually simply enhance their engagement with Southeast Asian states, including the countries that do not necessarily comply with the current international rules and norms. And then the third option is the strategic coordination. This option aims to empower ASEAN states like the enhanced engagement, but the United States and Japan are constrained by their limited resources, so they will make the most of their comparative advantage to do so. That is, the US can continuously engage Southeast Asia bilaterally, while Japan engage in the region comprehensively. And then since Japan has its long-standing experience in providing the infrastructure development and economic assistance, Japan can take the lead to those areas. And the United States will engage militarily through its allies in Southeast Asia and then strategic partners like Singapore. And this is again similar to the status quo policy, but the most important difference is that this aims to reassure ASEAN through the enhanced communication between Japan and ASEAN, and also between the United States and Japan. Japan can be the hub of those communication because of the again existence of strong communication lines between the Japan and South Korea, Southeast Asia, and also the trust that Japan has nurtured since the end of the World War II. So in so doing, the United States and Japan and ASEAN can communicate with each other and what institutional division of labor ASEAN and the new unilateral and multilateral frameworks they can actually provide. The downside of this policy strategic option is that there is a status quo bias in the resource commitments. Generally, this strategy aims to increase efficiency of the current commitment, and then there is no large shift in the existing allocation of the resources. So therefore, if some regional contingency occur in different sub-regions in the Indo-Pacific, this strategic coordination may not work well. So with these three options, in my paper, I argue that the strategic coordination is the most feasible and then effective option for the US and the Japanese Indo-Pacific strategies toward ASEAN. Because of this strategic option is to enhance the communications, I suggest the three basic recommendations to the United States and Japan. The first one is pretty simple. It is the institute or establish US-Japan policy coordination mechanism on the Southeast Asia or ASEAN. The United States and Japan actually had a meeting, the so-called the US-Japan Southeast Asia policy dialogue in June this year. So probably institutionalizing this meeting would facilitate to promote them to coordinate their own policies toward the Southeast Asia. And then second one is to define the strategic role of the ASEAN in the Pacific. Currently, there is no discussion on the relationship between ASEAN and the emerging groups in the Pacific. And so this should be clarified because it could, if they do so, it could reassure that the ASEAN will not be diplomatically marginalized by those new frameworks. And in this sense, Japan and the United States should actually mention what they mean by the ASEAN centrality, strategize the means to sustain ASEAN unity, and then clarify the division of labor among the existing and emerging institutions. And then lastly, the third one is probably this is the most controversial, but I would actually said prepare for the ASEAN's deeper disunity. ASEAN is currently weakening both internally and externally. internally, as I said, there has been the issue of the Myanmar, and then the ASEAN unity is in danger. And then externally, ASEAN may be losing its convening power because of the war in Ukraine. And in fact, if we take a look at some of the ASEAN's activities in the July this year, Australia, New Zealand, and United States boycotted the ADM plus counterterrorism export working group chaired by Russia and Myanmar. The heart of the ASEAN, benefit is that it could gather any kind of great powers, even though they may have some kind of strategic tensions. But increasingly, this is going to be difficult because some of them are actually boycotting. So I hope this is not going to be last for a long time, and then they could actually still come back to the ASEAN-led meeting. But then if this trend continues, maybe like the ASEAN can no longer function well. And then in this case, the United States and Japan may shift their strategies to benign neglect what I said in the first option, and focus on the enhancement of the new regional frameworks in the Indo-Pacific. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kay, for that incredibly perceptive analysis of the developments in the region and the possibilities of the United States and Japan taking action moving forward. So Prashant, you've been very patient. Kay's given us a lot to work with. He's laid out 3 visions for what the future might portend. I'm hoping that you might be able to share your thoughts on to what extent you agree or disagree with Kay's analysis.
Great, thanks Shihoko, and thanks Kay. That was, as Shihoko mentioned, very perceptive presentation, and I really enjoyed reading through the paper. I would say it's an extremely interesting topic, first of all, and very important topic, because I think it's very difficult, as you say in the introduction of the paper, to actually talk about Southeast Asia, US, and Japan without a connection between those 3. If you look at US commitment to Southeast Asia, essentially in the post-World War II period, it was partly built on the conception of the reconstruction of Japan and Japan's linkage to Southeast Asia as a major market, right? And in my own book on US commitment to Southeast Asia, it was actually really tough to get people in the region to talk about US cooperation with allies without bringing up Japan in that picture. You look at some of the metrics in the IC surveys that they do among elites, Japan is the most trusted power in Southeast Asia, and that's over multiple years. So amid this context of US-China competition, especially, and when people are thinking perhaps a little too narrowly in a bipolar fashion, I think this paper is extremely welcome in reminding us about the importance of Japan and also the importance of major powers in general in the region that have a really important influence. I would also say, just in terms of the contributions of the paper, just very quickly, I also think relative to, we have a lot of analysis already on US-Japan cooperation in various parts of the world and in Southeast Asia. This really distinguishes itself by looking at cooperation on ASEAN more specifically. And you identify very clearly the key challenge, which is that there's a lot of episodic cooperation, there's a lot of rhetoric, but when the rubber hits the road, is there really strategic clarity on how the United States and Japan cooperate on ASEAN specifically, institutionally, within the perspective of the Indo-Pacific? And I think that framing is extremely useful. And I think those 3 scenarios that you mentioned and options, the fact that you laid those out before the recommendations is also very helpful. I think often people adopt one lens and then they get to the recommendations. Here, it provides a really good opportunity because we are in a very uncertain context, as you noted in your remarks. China and its assertiveness, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's important to perhaps think about how to perhaps toggle between those options. So perhaps in certain periods when ASEAN is showing a little bit more of its weight, the United States and Japan, or either one of them, might engage a little bit more, but perhaps in other periods, there might be a little bit less of engagement on certain issues. I had a couple of things that the paper raised that came to mind that I think I just wanted to raise for discussion. One is, how we might think about the different scenarios by realm or by sector, right? So, for example, as you correctly pointed out, US-Japan cooperation in areas like perhaps on security might be a little bit easier to contemplate given the historical origins of the US-Japan alliance. But on democracy, on issues like Myanmar, there might be a little bit of difficulty coordinating there. And as the paper correctly notes, the way Japan engages ASEAN as an institution is very different from how the United States engages ASEAN. Japan, I almost feel like, as one Southeast Asian official once described to me, both the US and Japan recognize the limits and challenges of ASEAN as an institution. The difference is that Japan takes it as it is and still engages ASEAN. The United States sort of says, well, sometimes we want to engage ASEAN, sometimes we don't, depending on the administration and depending on the issue. And I think that's a division that the paper kind of comes to terms with by asking, should we, necessarily try to collaborate across the board, or do we kind of differentiate our approaches in that realm? I think the other aspect that's really interesting, the other reason why this is really important is because we are approaching sort of the summit season, and we have the perennial question about whether the US president is going to attend the next round of summitry. And we don't have similar questions for Japan, right? Irrespective of whether President Biden goes or not, that's really not the question. The issue is that there's always this question mark about US commitment and being judged on episodic events and developments in a way that Japan's commitment is not judged in a similar way. I think secondly, so first is whether we can talk about these scenarios by realm. The other is if we can talk about these by issue. It does strike me like if we came up with sort of a multi-layered Venn diagram of what the issue agenda looks like for US-Japan cooperation in ASEAN, that would actually be really useful. Both the US and Japan are in inflection points in their relationships with ASEAN, as we all know. The US is trying to elevate its relationship with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's hopefully going to take place at the end of this year. Japan is commemorating its 50th anniversary with ASEAN next year. And that's going to be a huge moment for the relationship where a lot of granular cooperation is going to be announced. When I look at what both sides are saying in the Indo-Pacific visions, Prime Minister Kishida and his remarks at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, he laid out actually a very comprehensive agenda that included economic security, even aspects of food security, in addition to maritime domain awareness. That was in contrast to some of the things we've heard about with respect to US policy on ASEAN. The Biden administration, I think, deserves tremendous credit for convening the ASEAN summit in spite of the earlier scheduling challenges. But I think there still are questions about, whether the Biden administration can level up on resources, and also how much of this is about US-China competition, and how much is it about addressing the real immediate needs of the region, and stress on immediate, because things like food security, things like energy prices. I just got back from Indonesia a few weeks ago. It was really difficult to talk about US Southeast Asia cooperation and US Indonesia cooperation without getting into domestic economic issues and tendencies and developments. And President Jokowi has talked about this in the context of his own visits to Russia and Ukraine. These are very major bread and butter issues for Indonesians and for Southeast Asia. And then I think the third and final thing I would say is, to what extent can we approach these three approaches, three scenarios by layer? So perhaps, and I know it's a little bit of a tricky situation, but to what extent does this involve engaging ASEAN, and to what extent does this involve other layers of cooperation? Is it minilateral institutions? Is it engaging with individual bilateral partners? And is it perhaps what US and Japan are doing globally and for their own, even domestically perhaps? And that could perhaps, catalyze what they're doing in terms of cooperation with ASEAN. So one of the things, and Kay has written about this in other contexts as well, including comparative institutional context globally. It's really interesting to see the institutional innovation within Southeast Asia. You are seeing, even if ASEAN is not doing something multilaterally, when the Mekong countries come up and say there are challenges that they're facing, ASEAN is forced to step up to the plate. When there are maritime patrols between a number of maritime Southeast Asian countries, other external powers are coming in and saying, can we cooperate? And then ASEAN feels like it needs to step up in a certain way. I agree, it's a contentious question about to what extent does it engage in all these other layers, detract from cooperation on ASEAN specifically, or does it actually catalyze it? Because that's the whole debate on the origin of ASEAN itself, right? Part of it is about what Southeast Asian states did, but ASEAN also arose in the context of, as we all know, the Cold War and more balance of power politics. So how do you thread that needle? That I think is a really interesting question. And I also think the bilateral piece is interesting too. We just saw, for example, the convening of the inaugural US, Japan, Philippines trilateral security dialogue. First time it was held at the Assistant Secretary of Defense level. Really interesting engagement. And I wonder if, I mean, we've had a period under Duterte where, frankly, it's been very difficult for the US, Japan to cooperate. And actually, it's been when US-Philippine relations were strained, Japan actually played a crucial role in actually making sure that the Philippines was able to engage partners other than China. Are we approaching now a period on some of these bilateral relationships where the United States and Japan can actually work on them, even if the ASEAN piece, might not be one that is conducive to? And there might be other examples as well. Cambodia is another one, where it's not a great situation on US-Cambodia relations right now. But actually, if you look at Japan, Japan has played an incredibly important role, even on the security side, in trying to do some of that cooperation. So I get, as I say, that's an open-ended question. To what extent does that help or hinder cooperation? But I think, that's an important question when we also look at smaller countries, primarily Brunei and Timor, where the US has not done historically as good of a job as engaging. But Japan, as Kay mentions in the paper very correctly, has had this very comprehensive approach that has been really useful to engage those countries. Because frankly, if we're talking about US-China competition, it's the smaller countries that are going to be the most vulnerable and have difficulty diversifying their ties. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Prashant, for really laying out some of the questions we really should be delving into now. Let me take some of the issues you laid out at the beginning, which is much more of a kind of bird's eye view perspective. The premise is that Japan has built up this trust, that there is continued Japanese commitment to Southeast Asia that is not, that really contrasts sharply to that of the United States. To what extent is that true moving forward? And if, for instance, you talked, Prashant, about possibility of coordinating on issues like democracy, dealing with the issue of Myanmar, does that jeopardize? Are there certain issues that would jeopardize some of the trust that Japan has built up with these countries over the years?
Yeah, thanks, Shiyoko. Those are both very good questions. I would say on the commitment question, I think there was a little bit initially a bit of uncertainty when we saw Prime Minister Abe's departure initially from the stage in Japan. And obviously, his passing is an important reminder for us about the personal role, very personal role that he played on Indo-Pacific security, but also, frankly, Southeast Asia. I mean, he single-handedly, I recall, visiting almost every single Southeast Asian country very quickly within the first few months of office. I mean, it was an incredibly important moment for the region. I think, there is always going to be this concern among some circles in Southeast Asia. I still, frankly, hear it today, that Japan could revert back to a revolving door of prime ministers that we saw before Prime Minister Abe. And I think there is that aspect of it. I think, frankly, we are also starting to see it's a very small pocket, but I have heard certain concerns about perhaps Japan evolving in, not now, but in 10, 20, 30 years as more of a swing state in US-China competition, perhaps cooperating a little bit more with China on the economic side, but still continuing to do things with the US on the security side. I'm frankly a bit doubtful given where the US-Japan alliance is today. But the regional perceptions, I think, on commitment are probably on those aspects and metrics. On the democracy question, I mean, I think this is like this is the elephant in the room probably when it comes to cooperation. I mean, my own personal view, frankly, is that there are very differing approaches to democracy and governance among the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, go down the list. And I think those partly are a product of not just approaches, but also domestic politics and the culture of these countries. And so I think there can be coordination on these big issues, but there also needs to be a little bit of leeway for countries to form their own approaches. I think you're seeing Japan slowly start to amend its approach, for example, on security assistance and cooperation with Myanmar. More specifically, we just saw an announcement in that respect. we may continue to see other developments as well. But as I said, I for one think that there's tremendous value if the United States is not able to engage certain Southeast Asian countries for its own domestic political reasons. There's value in Japan providing an alternative option. One thing you consistently hear in Southeast Asia, and all of us hear it, is US and China, what's the alternative? If you don't want us to pick China, who else is there? And Japan is first and foremost in these categories in terms of where these countries look to. So if we have too much of US-Japan synchronization and it becomes a like for like, irrespective of what US and Japan think, I also think from a regional perspective, it just narrows the region's choices. And you end up choosing on the basis of democracy rather than on aspects like, say, infrastructure, where actually the difference is a good thing. I recall being at a conference and a Southeast Asian official interrupted the proceedings and was like, why are we talking about US-China competition on infrastructure? It's actually a Japan-China competition on infrastructure. The United States is not really doing much on infrastructure relative to China and Japan. So I think that difference can work both ways. It can cut one way, but it can also cut on the other in a more positive direction. Thank
you. Let me turn it over to Kay about the possibility of too much cooperation and coordination and the risks that would pose. Especially because we haven't really talked about this, but the political risk of the United States itself too, and expectations for Japan to mitigate some of those risks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are really important and interesting questions. I guess my kind of own view is pretty much similar to what just Prashant said. That is the coordination is important, but like my kind of understanding of the coordination is more like an information sharing, and then it's not like we are going to create a united front. And there was a study done by I think pretty much long, 5 or 6 years ago by the East-West Center. The topic is what is what kind of role the U.S.-Japan alliance can play in the Southeast Asia. And then the kind of study is going into the Southeast Asia and ask about the role of the U.S.-Japan alliance. And then the people said, no, I mean, the U.S.-Japan alliance is great, but then don't come together, because then that actually is kind of really scary about if you are cooperating with the U.S.-Japan alliance, that means we are actually seen as opposing to the rise of China or the Chinese kind of engagement in the Southeast Asia. So there's a certain kind of perception we have to be really careful about this. But then at the same time, the difference is what I think the most important difference can be strengths. So the United States is actually play a really important role in engaging the particular Southeast Asia. They're they have resources. They could actually strengthen the strategic ties. They could actually go into the really concrete functional cooperation with those countries. But then at the same time, their kind of demand could be higher than the other countries. And then Japan could actually approach differently to these countries, such as, again, as we talked, the democracy promotion. The Japan's approach to the democracy is more kind of soft, try to kind of engage and then try to facilitate democratization through dialogues or through kind of education or workshop or those kind of things, instead of putting the economic sanctions on sometimes the country that could actually violated the democratic norms. So what I meant by the coordination is pretty much again the information sharing, and then what kind of benefits we can get by having those kind of different approaches. Because as the Prashant said, again, if we have the united front, and if we just kind of divide the just kind of two approaches, one is the US-Japan approach, and the other one is the China, then Southeast Asia countries can't choose which area to go. And if you don't choose the US-Japan, they may end up actually choosing the China, which is not choosing the side is not the really ideal situation for the Southeast Asian countries. So I guess this is important, but by having the communication, Japan can also reassure United States, saying this different kind of approach is not going to jeopardize or violate or hinder your approach. we could actually do more kind of coordination, and we could actually have the division of labor among the between the United States and Japan, so that the Southeast Asian countries could have more the strategic option to actually talk to the United States and Japan, and also the other countries.
Great. So we've seen this rise of new ways of cooperating, right? So you talk about information sharing, but we've seen this emergence of, refocus on the Quad, new roles for the Quad, the development of AUKUS, IPEF on the trade front. They are all emerging. And one of the things that you argue in your paper and in this presentation too, is that that has actually contributed to a greater fracturing of ASEAN as well. And at the same time, you also warn that we should be prepared for greater ASEAN disunity. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit more about, had these countries consulted more with ASEAN in advance in coming up with IPEF, for instance, would it have actually been a bigger part of coordination, regional coordination, or is this something completely separate?
So what I see is if we take a look at the current situation of the rise of multilateralism, or like the multilateral institutions not led by the ASEAN, then the question is again, like, how do you actually manage ASEAN centrality? Because we emphasize the importance of ASEAN centrality in the Pacific, but like, nobody knows what it means. Because if you actually emphasize the ASEAN centrality, ASEAN should be the center of the regionalism, or ASEAN should be the center of the institutional arrangement. But obviously, those are not like discussed clearly. And then I think if they have something like in mind, that's okay. But again, I haven't actually heard anything about it from the US side or Japanese side. And I understand this because the ASEAN centrality is really vague kind of the concept. And even among the ASEAN member states, there might be some kind of disagreement in defining the ASEAN centrality too. But then just kind of keep saying this actually creates a confusion. And people would say, I mean, okay, so IPEF and then the Quad and AUKUS, there are a bunch of the new arrangements coming up. And how do you actually manage the ASEAN centrality? Nobody actually talk about this. And then probably like some of the ASEAN countries would actually raise the concern. Okay, so this may actually diplomatically marginalize ASEAN. And then that means the ASEAN, some of the ASEAN member states is going to oppose the new arrangement. And then the ASEAN would not be able to support those kind of new movements too. So what I see is those are the kind of confusion we need to clarify. And then if we just kind of keep continuing this, ambiguously, then probably like there should be some kind of like the countries. So for example, the Cambodia actually talks about raise concern about the establishment of IPEF, because the Cambodia was not like invited to the IPEF, and then they were not a member. And some of the op-eds in the Cambodian newspaper actually said this could actually this could be harmful to the ASEAN centrality. So ASEAN is actually working on the basis of consensus decision making. And if the one country actually opposes it, the whole ASEAN kind of process is going to stop. And so this is actually like really important implication for ASEAN. Like if we are actually emphasizing the importance of ASEAN, or like ASEAN centrality or ASEAN unity, maybe like we have to communicate how actually those the different kind of the regional institutions play a role in the Indo-Pacific, and what kind of division of labor like we are trying to achieve. And then so that the ASEAN, all the ASEAN countries can be reassured that like the ASEAN is not going to be marginalized.
Thank you. Prashant, I'm wondering whether you agree with that, this whole idea of ASEAN is based first and foremost on consensus building, and a lot of these new initiatives that are emerging, especially from the United States, actually challenge that agenda of consensus building from the front.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the points that Kay raised, I would associate myself with those in terms of the challenges within the region. I would say, it also depends a lot on how these mechanisms actually evolve. So, for example, on the Quad, I mean, we're now in the third iteration, effectively, of the institution. We are seeing a little bit of a change in terms of the messaging, and we have to see how this plays out. Because it's still early days, but we are seeing a mechanism where there's essentially the old questions about, is this about China or is this about more than China? It's evolved into a bit of an and conversation rather than or conversation, right? So we are seeing these countries talk about China and very sensitive geopolitical issues in private, but we're also seeing them talk more publicly about scholarships and technology cooperation in public. And I think that plays a very important role. It might be symbolic, but it plays a very important role in Southeast Asia in terms of providing that reassurance that Kay mentioned. And I think a lot of this, to Kay's point about to what extent are we talking about a united front versus coordination, and basically even more communication. That's extremely important. I think a lot of the ASEAN reservations initially, not all of them, but some of the ASEAN reservations on the Quad were about the lack of consultation and coordination. And I think they make a fair point. I think a lot of Southeast Asian countries were very puzzled about why, and I think there are some clues in there about why the Biden administration chose to message it this way. Why was AUKUS sort of revealed as something that was more military and security focused, when just right before we had Australia and the United States essentially agree on a range of issues, including talking about their cooperation in the Mekong and their cooperation in Southeast Asia. US-UK cooperation, both of them are doing tremendously helpful stuff in Southeast Asia individually, and they could just collectivize all of that in terms of education cooperation. Brunei's got an important military presence in Brunei, for example. They do a lot of operations there. The US is working with the UK in that respect as well. So a lot of this is about messaging, collaboration, and communication. I think there's always going to be some trade-off there. One other positive example I'll mention, Shihoko, because you did mention IPEF. I thought it was, from my perspective, I thought very useful how the Biden administration chose to launch IPEF in Japan, because I think it spoke to Japan's very powerful role in actually keeping the TPP, CPTPP alive when the United States withdrew. And also, frankly, there are a lot of conversations, to Shihoko's earlier point, about the US commitment as a variable, looking at 2022 and 2024, Southeast Asian countries sort of thinking, how much do we really want to join this initiative and put all our chips in there if this is not going to be an initiative that's going to be around in 2 or 3 years? And they're asking those questions. The fact that Japan is there does provide that sort of stabilizing. It's not a substitute for what the United States can do, but it at least is a stabilizing, anchoring mechanism for how the Southeast Asian countries can perceive the initiative.
Okay, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but one of the things I did want to point out about IPEF is that, Japan was actually very instrumental too in making sure that a broader swath of ASEAN countries, including Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, were included, and that the United States, the Biden administration's gut response had been to do this quickly. And so it would only reach out to the obvious countries like Singapore, and then Australia, Japan, Korea. And it was only because Japan really took that effort to reach out to a broader grouping and to say that instead of making this initially into something that they would sign on to, that this was simply an opportunity to talk about it. And there was no commitment. It was just an opportunity to discuss, right? So I want to talk a little bit, Chris Johnson, you talked a bit about some of the issues that the two countries could work together on regarding Southeast Asia, and infrastructure is something where we are facing great competition between the United States and its allies versus China. There is, of course, limited resources. Kay talks about resources as something that is finite, and that there needs to, given the limited resources, what can we do? So Kay, I want to ask you about Now, what do you mean by resources? And when we talk about the infrastructure component, as an instance, because this is where really a lot of the demand in Southeast Asia, that across the 10 countries, we need that commitment. What do you see as resources, and how reliable can these resource allocations be from both the United States and Japan?
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, those are really, really important points. And then I actually, the previous point I wanted to kind of talk a little bit more, but then that's okay. I think, yeah, I'm just gonna so focus on the infrastructure one. So the one thing I would say is that if you are competing with China about the kind of how much infrastructure you can provide to Southeast Asia, I think this is wrong way to do this, because I mean, at the end of the day, like if you compare the amount of the resources, economic resources, China has and then Japan has, then there's a big differences. And then Japan might not be able to actually compete with the China for that end. So I think the one way to do this is not competing the kind of amount of resources, but basically what Japan did was Japan launched the concept of the quality infrastructure. And then this quality infrastructure focuses on, even though the Japanese government said like we are not like discarding the quantity, I think like their kind of main focus is more on the quality. And then the quality means you could actually have the more kind of economic viability, and then the sustainability of the environment, and then also local community protection, etc., etc. So I think like this is the way they actually need to kind of care about. And I did some of the studies about infrastructure development in Southeast Asia back in the 2017 or 2018, and then talked about the Southeast Asian countries. And the question is again like the quality models, and then they don't actually want to get the infrastructure that could destroy the local communities or the environment in that end. So these are the kind of with the limited resources, like with the limited, I mean, economic and also financial resources, they can't actually do everything. But when they do, I would actually say they should actually focus on the quality. And then this longer term, the Southeast Asian countries are going to be attracted by the quality, because it's gonna last longer, and it's gonna actually not destroying the environment it doesn't degrade the environment in the local communities and etc. So I guess this is the kind of a way to do from the Japan and the US the perspective.
I don't know if you want to go back to the thought that you had earlier before.
Yeah, so so okay, so the IPEF, I completely agree with the Shoko-san and Prashant that the institution is evolving, and also the Shoko-san mentioned Japan actually played a role to invite the wide range of the members for the IPEF, and the United States took it, and that's great. I think like this should be the kind of trend like we should continue. It's not, even though like the United States play a really important role, and probably like a leading role in those newly emerged institutions, but then if you could actually see the outsiders or like the other members who could actually raise a hand and then talk about what they want, and then what they actually want to see from that kind of institution, and then if the institution incorporated, there's a possibility for member states to shape the form of the institution. And this actually gives the assurance to the member states and also ASEAN, because if ASEAN says, oh, this is not what I want to see, then probably like the institution could modify its strategy and then also its form. And then so that they could actually reach out some of the agreement, and then find out the division of labor between those institutions. So I guess this should be the more kind of systematized, and then also the communication with the ASEAN, and then also the each institution should be strengthened. So that's what I wanted to actually say.
Thank you. I want to go back to this idea, Prashant, that you heard about Japan being a red state or a blue state. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And I'd really like to hear Kay's comment on it before we wrap things up.
Yeah, so this is the notion of like, Japan potentially being a swing state in terms of like US-China competition, and whether Japan would, rather than a US ally in 10 or 20 or 30 years, actually be in a situation where it would be too economically close to China, that it wouldn't be able to preserve the political and security ties, the deep political and security ties that it has with the United States. And I think this goes to the question that you raised earlier, Chihoko, about when these countries are making multi-decade long sort of plans about what their alignment futures are going to be, like how do they think about the alternatives to US-China competition? So ASEAN likes to say it's not a bipolar world, it's a multipolar world. But what are the major poles that we are really talking about? So Japan is one of the few stable poles that ASEAN has had and been able to rely on. But I think the big worry and ambivalence there is that if we see a Japan that is a bit removed from that situation, how would that Japan evolve and behave? And what would that mean for this context of where these countries are already relying on China? So is it then, who else is going to step up? Is it, South Korea? Is it Australia? And all of these countries have their own, opportunities, but then also challenges. Similar with India. I think there's a lot of things that Prime Minister Modi has done, but we haven't really seen a lot of that still translate into actions, particularly on the economic side. And I think the economic side is really where that is probably the main anxiety or concern, particularly in the context of like these economic security challenges we're seeing, like on supply chains and the like. If Japan doesn't play that role of diversification and an alternative, whether it's on things like infrastructure and so on and so forth, where else does Southeast Asia go in that respect? It would have to be probably a mix of different options, but it would be a big change in terms of the balance of power in that respect.
Yeah, and I think it's really clear that expectations for Japan as a political leader, as well as an economic power, is only increasing. And Kay, I'd really like to turn it to you to have the last word to bring us home on this big topic.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I don't know like if I could actually answer everything like in the 1 or 2 minutes, but then I guess it's kind of really interesting to hear that some of the Southeast Asian they are actually concerned about this. Japan could be the swing state in Southeast Asia. I guess, but theoretically, it's a possibility in the longer run, because even though what I actually see, I would say is that if Japan is actually declining economically, and then also if Japan is losing its kind of economic leverage significantly, and then weakening some of the ties with the United States, maybe Japan could actually be more like the swing state. To aligning with China economically, and then also but like they want to actually still stick to the United States in terms of the security realm. So I guess that's the kind of one concern that like we may see in the future. But again, for now, I think like the Japan still already took the position to align with the United. I mean, basically the more kind of closely aligned with the United States. So I guess that's in the near future, it's not gonna be probably possible, but like in the longer run, that could be the possibility.
Well, and also, I mean, given the big trustworthiness that Japan enjoys in the region, the reservoir of trust, and China's own actions, it's also irrespective of what Japan does. China seems to be striking a pretty clear path, which I think puts the rest of the region, I think, on a path to clarity as well in that respect. So unless that changes, I think that's also another calculation in that respect, right?
All right, gentlemen, our time is up, but I really do want to thank you for being here today. And Kay, thank you so much for providing us with the framework to really focus on Southeast Asia and assess the importance of ASEAN and the relationship that the ASEAN countries have with both Japan and the United States. This is an ongoing, evolving situation. I know that we will continue to look closely to your work and to your analysis. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for being a Japan scholar and committing your valuable time to be with us here in Washington. Thank you, Prashant, for being here.
Thank you.
We will have the link to Kay's policy brief together with this video, and we look forward to seeing you on another occasion with the Wilson Centers. Thank you.
Congrats, Kay. Thank you,
Thank
Shihoko.
you very much.
Take care, you both.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.